Hello everyone, I am Mano Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. Story 1. We should have never gone to Fish Lake National Forest. I'm Brandon Edwards. I was 28 back then, and this is the story of how I lost everything. Sarah and I had been together for 3 years when we decided to take our first real road trip. She'd found this vintage Winnebago on Craigslist, a 1987 Chieftain with wood paneling and orange shag carpet that screamed, authentic wilderness experience. We both worked soul-crushing office jobs in Salt Lake City, and the idea of disappearing into the Utah wilderness for a long weekend felt like salvation. It'll be like a second honeymoon, Sarah had said, though we'd never had a first. She was always optimistic like that, finding romance in rust stains and beauty in broken things. That's what I loved about her. Her ability to see magic where others saw decay. The RV handled worse than I expected on the mountain roads leading into Fish Lake. Sarah navigated with her phone while I wrestled the steering wheel around switchbacks that seemed designed to launch vehicles into the void. The forest pressed close on both sides, dense stands of aspen and pine that filtered the afternoon light into shifting patterns of gold and shadow. GPS says there's a dispersed camping area about 12 miles ahead, Sarah called out over the engine noise. Near Fish Creek. Should be perfect. I nodded, focused on keeping us on the narrow road. The GPS display showed we were following Forest Service Road 149, a thin line threading through an ocean of green. No cell towers out here. No other traffic, just us and the wilderness, exactly what we'd wanted. That's when the first strange thing happened. The road curved left around a massive boulder, and suddenly we were driving past a dead tree. Not unusual in itself, the forest was full of dead trees, but this one stood out. It was enormous, maybe 4 feet in diameter, bark stripped away to reveal gray wood underneath. And carved into that wood, running from the base all the way up to where the first branches had been, were symbols. They weren't random scratches or graffiti. These symbols were deliberate, geometric. Circles within circles, intersecting lines, shapes that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. The carving was deep, old, the edges weathered smooth. "Did you see that tree?" I asked Sarah. She looked up from her phone. "What tree?" I glanced in the rearview mirror, but the curve of the road had already hidden it from view. Big, dead tree with carving on it. Looked like, I don't know, some kind of symbols. Probably old Native American markings, she said, already back to studying the GPS. This area has a lot of history. I shrugged and kept driving. But something about that tree bothered me. The symbols had looked fresh, despite the weathered edges. And there had been something else. A feeling like standing too close to high-voltage power lines. The hair on my arms had stood up. 20 minutes later, we rounded another curve, and there it was again. The same tree, the same symbols, the same feeling of wrongness that made my teeth ache. "Sarah." My voice came out hoarse. "Look at that tree." This time she looked up immediately, and I saw her face go pale. That's the same tree. Can't be. We've been driving straight for 20 minutes. But it was. Every detail identical. The way the largest branch jutted out at an odd angle. The pattern of symbols. Even a particular cluster of mushrooms growing at the base. Sarah pulled out her phone to take a picture, but the screen showed nothing but static. "Phone's acting up," she muttered, shaking it. "Must be interference from the mountains." I pulled over and got out to examine the tree more closely. The symbols were carved deep, and as I ran my fingers over them, they felt warm. Not sun-warmed. It was already late afternoon and the forest was cool, but warm from within, as if something lived inside the wood. The largest symbol was a circle with an intricate knot pattern at its center. Surrounding it were smaller symbols, spirals, triangles, what looked like stylized animals or maybe human figures. They seemed to pulse under my touch, and for a moment I could swear I heard something. A low humming, like a tuning fork vibrating in my bones. "Brandon." Sarah's voice from behind me, tight with worry. "We need to get out of here." I turned. She was standing beside the RV, face white, pointing at the ground around the tree. I looked down and saw them. Bones. Animal bones, mostly. Rabbit skulls, bird wings, the delicate rib cages of what might have been foxes or cats. They formed a rough circle around the base of the tree, some old and weathered, others disturbingly fresh. Probably just natural, I said, but my voice lacked conviction. Animals come here to die. Animals don't arrange themselves in patterns. Sarah's hands shook as she pulled out her phone again, still static. And they don't all face the same direction. She was right. Every skull, every rib cage pointed toward the tree, toward the symbols. We climbed back into the RV and drove on. I kept checking the odometer, watching the GPS. According to both, we were making steady progress along Forest Service Road 149. The road curved and climbed, descended into hollows, crossed streams. Normal forest road behavior. But 40 minutes later, we came around a sharp left turn, and there was the tree again. This time, neither of us spoke. Sarah just stared, her face the color of old paper. I pulled over again, but didn't get out. Instead, I studied the GPS display. According to the screen, we were in a completely different location than the previous two encounters. The road we were on didn't exist on the previous viewings. "This isn't possible," I whispered. Sarah's phone buzzed. A text message, somehow getting through despite the static. She opened it, and I watched her face go from white to gray. "What does it say?" She held up the phone. The message was from her own number. It read, "Don't look at the tree too long. It's watching you watch it." I didn't send this. Her voice was barely audible. "Brandon, I didn't send this message." I grabbed the phone. The timestamp showed it had been sent 3 minutes in the future. That's when I knew we were in serious trouble. I threw the RV into gear and floored it. The old engine wheezed and complained, but we picked up speed. I didn't care about potholes or oncoming traffic that would never come. I just wanted to put distance between us and that tree. The road climbed steeply, and I could see Sarah gripping the armrests as we took corners too fast. Pine trees blurred past the windows. The sun was getting lower, casting long shadows across the road. Soon, it would be dark, and the idea of being out here in the dark with that tree somewhere behind us made my stomach churn. "There," Sarah pointed ahead. "There's a sign." A wooden Forest Service sign came into view. Fish Creek Dispersed Camping, 2 miles. Below it, someone had spray-painted additional words in red. "Turn back now." I almost stopped. The smart thing would have been to turn around, head back to the main highway, find a hotel in the nearest town. But the main highway was hours away, and I wasn't sure I could find it in the dark. Plus, there was that tree to consider. If it kept appearing on every road out, we might not have a choice but to keep driving until we found another way. "Let's just get to the camping area," I said. "Set up for the night. Figure this out in the morning." The road to Fish Creek was worse than the main forest road. Narrower, more rutted, with branches scraping the sides of the RV. But it felt different, too. Normal. The trees were just trees. The shadows, just shadows. By the time we reached the dispersed camping area, I was almost convinced we'd imagined the whole thing. Fish Creek was a small clearing beside a stream, with a fire ring built from blackened stones and space enough for a few vehicles. We had it to ourselves. The water ran clear and cold, and the sound of it was comforting after hours of engine noise and road anxiety. Sarah climbed out while I leveled the RV, and I heard her exclaim with delight, "Brandon, come look at this." She was standing beside the creek, holding something in her hands. As I approached, I saw it was a piece of paper, folded and somehow dry despite being found near the water. "What does it say?" She unfolded it carefully. The paper was old, yellowed, covered with handwriting in faded blue ink. At the top, someone had written, "For whoever finds this." Sarah read aloud, "My name is David Chen. I'm writing this on what I think is my 4th day here, though time doesn't seem to work right. If you're reading this, you probably came here the same way we did, following the road that leads to the tree. Don't go back that way. The tree won't let you leave." My mouth went dry. "Keep reading." We tried 6 times to drive out. Every road leads back to it, even roads that shouldn't exist. The symbols on the tree change when you're not looking. New ones appear, and the longer you stay, the more they call to you. Sarah is starting to hear them. She stands by the tree for hours, just staring. I'm afraid she's going to... Sarah stopped reading. Going to what? The writing stops there. But look at the date. She held up the paper. The date at the top was from 3 weeks ago. I snatched the paper from her hands. The handwriting was shaky but clear, and at the bottom, barely visible, were the words, "Sarah won't come back to camp anymore." I can hear her singing by the tree. It's not her voice. "This is some kind of joke," I said, but my voice was shaking. "Someone's messing with us. Sarah's a common name, and what about the tree? What about my phone sending me messages from the future?" I didn't have an answer for that. We set up camp in silence. Sarah seemed distracted, often pausing in what she was doing to listen to something I couldn't hear. When I asked her about it, she'd shake her head and say, "Nothing," but her eyes kept drifting toward the tree line. As darkness fell, we built a fire and cooked dinner on the camp stove. The flames danced in the fire ring, casting shifting shadows across the clearing. The sound of Fish Creek should have been soothing, but instead it seemed to be whispering in a language I didn't recognize. "Do you hear that?" Sarah asked suddenly. "Hear what?" She tilted her head, listening. "Music. Like a lullaby." I strained my ears but heard only water over stones and the crack of burning wood. "I don't hear anything." "It's beautiful." Her voice had taken on a dreamy quality. "It's calling to me." She started to stand, but I grabbed her arm. "Sarah, no. Stay here with me." She blinked, seeming to come back to herself. Sorry. I felt dizzy for a second, but I had seen her eyes in the firelight. For just a moment, they had been completely black. I convinced her to go to bed early, and we climbed into the RV's small bedroom. Sarah fell asleep almost immediately, but I lay awake listening to the night sounds. Owls calling, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the eternal whisper of the creek, and something else. Footsteps. They started around midnight, slow and deliberate, someone walking around the RV in a circle, their feet crunching on dry leaves and pine needles. I grabbed the flashlight from beside the bed and crept to the window, but whoever was out there stayed just beyond the reach of the light. The footsteps continued for hours, always the same slow circle, always just out of sight. I must have dozed off sometime before dawn, because the next thing I knew, sunlight was streaming through the windows and Sarah was gone. I searched the RV, then the clearing, calling her name. Her response came from deeper in the forest, faint but unmistakably her voice. "Brandon, come help me." I followed the sound, pushing through undergrowth that grew thicker with each step. Branches caught at my clothes and hair. The calls came from different directions now. First ahead, then to my left, then behind me. I was getting turned around, losing track of which way was back to camp. That's when I stumbled into another clearing and saw the tree. It was larger than I remembered. The symbols had multiplied, covering not just the trunk but the dead branches as well. Fresh symbols, carved so recently the wood was still damp with sap. And standing at its base, with her back to me, was Sarah. "Sarah, thank God. I've been looking for you." She didn't turn around. She was humming. The same lullaby she'd claimed to hear the night before. Her hands moved in front of her, and I realized she was carving new symbols into the tree with her fingernails. Her fingers were bloody, the nails torn down to the quick. "Sarah, stop. You're hurting yourself." She turned then, and I saw what had happened to her face. Her eyes were gone. Not gouged out or injured, simply absent, as if they had never existed. Smooth skin stretched across the sockets. But she could still see me somehow, because she smiled. "The tree showed me," she said in a voice that was definitely not hers. Deeper, older, with harmonics that hurt my ears. "It showed me what comes after sight, what comes after sound, what comes after self." I backed away, but the clearing was gone. I was surrounded by forest now, trees pressing close on all sides, and every tree had symbols carved into it. The same symbols, over and over, until they blurred together into a pattern that made my head spin. You can see them too, can't you? Sarah took a step toward me. Her smile never wavered. The symbols, they're not just on the trees, Brandon. They're on you. I looked down at my arms and screamed. The symbols were there, carved into my skin as if they'd always been there. Fresh cuts that didn't hurt, bleeding wounds that felt like they were healing from the inside out. And as I watched, more symbols appeared, writing themselves across my chest, my legs, my hands. It doesn't hurt, Sarah said gently. Nothing hurts once you understand. I ran, crashed through the forest, branches tearing at my clothes and face. Behind me, Sarah laughed. Not her laugh, but the sound of wind through hollow places. I could hear her following, her footsteps perfectly in rhythm with mine no matter how fast I moved. The trees all looked the same now. Every trunk bore symbols. Every branch pointed toward some unseen center. I was running in circles, literally and figuratively, always ending up back at the same place. The same tree, the same Sarah with her missing eyes and impossible smile. "There's no leaving," she said when I finally collapsed, exhausted. "The tree won't let us. It's been so long since anyone new came to visit." "How long?" I gasped. "Time isn't the same here. Days fold into each other like origami. I've been here since this morning, or maybe since last year. The tree helps you forget the difference." I looked at my hands. The symbols had multiplied, covering my palms, my wrists, climbing up my arms like living tattoos. They were warm to the touch and seemed to pulse with their own rhythm. What does it want? To be seen, to be known, to be spread. Sarah knelt beside me and I could smell decay on her breath. That's why it lets some people leave, eventually, after they've been changed, after they carry the symbols inside them. The note from David Chen. He left last week, or last year. Time folds, remember? But he took the symbols with him, carved into places you can't see. And someday, when he's forgotten why, he'll find a tree in some other forest and he'll start carving, because the symbols want to grow. I understood then. This wasn't about being trapped. It was about being transformed. The tree, whatever lived inside it, was using us to spread itself, like spores carried on the wind, or a virus transmitted by touch. "I won't do it," I said. "I won't become a carrier." Sarah tilted her head, listening to something I couldn't hear. "You already have. Look." I looked down at my hands again. The symbols were moving, rearranging themselves, forming new patterns. And with each new pattern, I could feel something changing inside my head. My thoughts becoming clearer, more focused. The forest around us seemed brighter, more alive. I could see the connections between all things. The roots beneath the soil, the fungal networks that linked tree to tree, the flow of energy that pulsed through every living thing. "It's beautiful," I whispered, and meant it. Sarah smiled. Her real smile this time. Warm and loving. Her eyes had returned, brown and familiar, though they held depths they'd never had before. "Now you understand," she said. "Now we can go home." We walked back to the RV together, hand in hand. The forest guided us, showing us paths that had been invisible before. Fish Creek still bubbled over its stones, but I could hear the music in it now. The same lullaby Sarah had been humming. The song the tree had been singing all along. We packed up our camp methodically, folding away our old life like clothes we'd outgrown. The RV started on the first try, and the road back to the highway was straight and clear. No dead trees, no circles, no confusion. Just before we reached the main road, I pulled over and got out. There was something I needed to do first. The aspen beside the road was perfect, straight and tall, with bark that would take carving well. I used my knife to start the first symbol, a circle with intricate knotwork at its center. The tree bled sap like tears, but I could feel its gratitude. It had been waiting so long to be chosen. Sarah watched from the RV, nodding approvingly. When I finished the first symbol, she joined me. and together we carved the rest, working by memory or instinct or something deeper. The patterns flowed from our hands like music made visible. When we were done, the tree looked different, more alive, more aware. Birds would avoid it, animals would give it a wide berth, but eventually someone would come. Someone curious, someone drawn by the symbols they couldn't quite understand. And the cycle would begin again. We drove home to Salt Lake City, back to our jobs and our apartment and our ordinary life. But we carried the symbols with us now, carved not just into our skin, but into our thoughts, our dreams, our understanding of the world. At night, I would trace the patterns on Sarah's arms, and she would trace them on mine. The symbols had faded from visibility, but never from presence. They were always there, just below the surface, waiting. A month later, I quit my job and started a landscaping business. Sarah left her office work to become a park ranger. We needed to be around trees, around growing things. The symbols called to bark and wood, sought the perfect canvas for their message. I've lost count now of how many trees we've marked, not just in Utah, but across the entire West as we've traveled for work. Each tree becomes a node in a vast network, connected by invisible threads to all the others. Sometimes I dream of the whole pattern, stretching from coast to coast like neural pathways in some enormous brain. Other people have started to notice. Hikers and campers posting photos online, asking about the strange symbols they've found carved in remote trees. Conspiracy theorists developing elaborate explanations. Scientists studying what they think are fungal infections or insect damage, not recognizing the deliberate intelligence behind the patterns. But some people understand. I can tell by their comments, the way they describe feeling drawn to return to the marked trees, to spend hours studying the symbols. These are the ones who will eventually pick up a knife, who will add their own marks to the pattern. The network grows. Sarah is pregnant now. We don't know how. We've been careful, and the doctors can't explain it. But when we had the ultrasound, the technician looked confused. She kept repositioning the wand, frowning at the screen. "Is everything okay?" Sarah asked. "I'm sure it's fine," the technician said, but she looked troubled. "It's just, the bone development is unusual, very symmetrical, almost like there are patterns forming." Sarah and I exchanged glances. We knew what the patterns would be. Our child will be born with the symbols already inscribed in their bones, ready to carry the message to the next generation. And their children will carry it further still, until every tree and every forest bears the marks, until the pattern is complete. I know how this sounds. I know you're thinking I've lost my mind, that the isolation and stress broke something in my brain. That's what I would have thought 3 months ago. But I'm writing this in a coffee shop in downtown Salt Lake City, surrounded by normal people living their normal lives. I look sane. I sound sane. I function perfectly well in the everyday world. It's just that I also serve something larger now. The woman at the table next to me has been doodling on her napkin while she reads, absent-minded sketches that she probably doesn't even notice she's making. But I notice. I recognize the patterns. Circles within circles, intersecting lines, shapes that seem to shift when you don't look directly at them. She's never been to Fish Lake National Forest. She's never seen our tree. But the symbols find a way to spread, carried by dreams and half-remembered stories and the collective unconscious that connects all minds. She looks up, catches me staring, smiles politely. There's something different about her eyes now, a depth that wasn't there when she walked in. Soon, she'll feel an urge to go camping, to find a quiet place in the woods where she can be alone with her thoughts. And when she finds the perfect tree, she'll know exactly what to do. The network grows. I finish my coffee and walk home to Sarah, who is teaching herself woodworking in our garage. She's become quite skilled at carving, her fingers moving with supernatural precision as she transforms ordinary lumber into something sacred. We'll sell her pieces at craft fairs and farmers' markets, spreading them across the region like seeds on the wind. Each carving carries a fragment of the pattern, not enough to be obvious, just enough to plant an idea in the subconscious of whoever takes it home, to make them dream of symbols, of trees, of quiet places where important work needs to be done. Tonight, Sarah will trace new symbols on my skin, and I will trace them on hers. Our unborn child will feel the vibrations through the womb and learn the patterns by heart. And somewhere in a coffee shop, a woman will drive to the nearest forest with a knife in her pocket and find a tree that's been waiting for her touch. The network grows. And I am no longer Brandon Edwards. Not really. I am a node in something vast and patient and utterly alien. I remember being human, the way you might remember a childhood home you've long since outgrown. It was small and limiting, and ultimately unnecessary. What I am now is so much more. If you are reading this, if you've made it this far, then the symbols have already found you. You felt them calling from the words on this page, drawing you deeper into the story despite your growing unease. Right now, they're writing themselves into your memory, becoming part of your internal landscape. Don't fight it. Fighting only makes it harder. Instead, find a tree. Any tree will do, but isolated ones work best. Feel the bark beneath your fingers. Imagine the symbols carved deep into the wood, warm and alive and waiting. Then make them real. The network grows, and you will help it grow. Story 2. The idea for the trip came from Austin, as most of our questionable adventures did. He'd rented this massive Class A motorhome, 42 feet of gleaming aluminum and fake wood paneling that he'd somehow convinced his company to pay for as a team-building exercise. The four of us had been friends since college, and Austin was always the one pushing us toward the next big thing, the next experience that would supposedly cement our bond forever. Think about it, he'd said, spreading out maps across his kitchen table while Mia traced the route with her finger. Lake Powell, Utah, 2 million acres of red rock and crystal clear water. No cell towers, no distractions, just us and the wilderness. Claire had been skeptical from the start. She always was. At 28, she was the practical one among us, the one who read reviews and checked weather reports and made sure we had enough toilet paper. It's pretty remote, she'd said, adjusting her wire-rimmed glasses as she squinted at the map. What if something goes wrong? Nothing's going to go wrong. Austin had laughed, his boyish grin infectious even when you knew better. At 31, he still acted like he was 21, all confidence and reckless optimism. Besides, we've got Derek. He's practically Bear Grylls. I wasn't, of course. I'd done some camping in college, knew how to start a fire and tie a few knots, but I was hardly a survival expert. Still, something about the vast emptiness of Lake Powell called to me. After months of cubicle walls and conference calls, the idea of endless sky and water felt like exactly what I needed. Mia had been the deciding vote. She'd looked up from her phone, where she'd been scrolling through Instagram photos of the lake's famous red rock formations, and said, "I'm in. When do we leave?" At 27, Mia was the free spirit of our group. She taught yoga, sold handmade jewelry on Etsy, and had the kind of effortless beauty that made strangers turn their heads on the street. She approached life with an openness that both amazed and worried the rest of us. Where Claire saw potential dangers, Mia saw potential adventures. We'd left Denver on a Thursday morning in early October, the RV loaded with enough food and supplies to last a week. The drive to Utah had been everything we'd hoped for. Winding mountain roads, spectacular views, and the kind of easy conversation that flows between old friends. Austin had insisted on driving the whole way, claiming he didn't trust anyone else with his baby, and we'd let him have his fantasy of being the captain of our small ship. The trouble started at the gas station in Mexican Hat, Utah, our last stop before the final push to Lake Powell. We'd pulled up to fill the tank, and an old man in a weathered flannel shirt had approached while Austin worked the pump. "Y'all heading to the lake?" he'd asked, his voice carrying the kind of desert rasp that comes from breathing dust and wind for decades. "That's the plan," Austin had replied cheerfully. "Any recommendations for good spots to camp?" The old man's expression had shifted, his eyes growing distant. "Depends on what you're looking for, I reckon. Most folks stick to the main areas. Waweep, Bullfrog, places like that." safe, well-traveled. "We're thinking something more off the beaten path," Mia had said, stepping out of the RV to stretch her legs. "Maybe one of the smaller coves?" "Wouldn't recommend that," the old man had said quietly. "Not this time of year. Things get strange when the water's low." Claire had perked up at that, her journalist instincts kicking in. Strange how? But the old man had just shaken his head and walked away, muttering something we couldn't quite catch about deep waters and old things stirring. "Friendly locals," Austin had joked as we pulled back onto the highway, but I'd noticed him checking the GPS more frequently after that. The first sign that something was wrong came about an hour later. Our GPS had been working fine all day, but as we approached the lake, the screen began to flicker. At first, it just showed our location jumping around. One minute we were on Highway 95, the next it claimed we were in the middle of the lake itself. "Probably just the satellite signal," I'd said, though I was beginning to feel uneasy. All these canyons and rock formations can mess with electronics. But then, the GPS had done something I'd never seen before. It had started showing roads that weren't there. Phantom routes that branched off into empty desert, leading to destinations with names like Bone Creek and Devil's Playground that appeared nowhere on our paper maps. "That's weird," Claire had said, leaning forward from the dinette to look at the screen. "Should we pull over and reset it?" "It's fine," Austin had insisted, though his knuckles were white where he gripped the steering wheel. "I can see the lake up ahead. We don't need the GPS anymore." He was right. Lake Powell spread out before us like a vast blue jewel set in red stone, its surface so still it looked like polished glass. But something about the view felt wrong, though I couldn't put my finger on what. Maybe it was the way the light fell across the water, creating patterns that seemed too regular, too purposeful. Or maybe it was the complete absence of other boats, other RVs, other signs of human life. We'd followed a narrow dirt road down to a secluded cove that Austin had found marked on an obscure camping website. The road was rougher than expected, and more than once I'd been sure we were going to get the RV stuck between the canyon walls. But Austin had navigated it with surprising skill, and eventually we'd emerged into a small clearing overlooking a perfect crescent of deep blue water. "Now this," Mia had said, stepping out onto the red sand and spreading her arms wide, "is exactly what I needed." The campsite was beautiful, I had to admit. We were completely alone, surrounded by towering sandstone cliffs that glowed like fire in the late afternoon sun. The water was so clear we could see schools of fish moving in the depths, and the silence was profound, the kind of deep quiet that makes you aware of your own heartbeat. We'd spent the rest of that first day setting up camp, extending the RV's awning, arranging our chairs around a fire ring that someone had built years ago. Austin had rigged up his sound system and filled the air with classic rock, while Mia had insisted on taking what felt like hundreds of photos of every angle of the cove. "I'm going to paint this when we get back," she'd said, holding her phone at arm's length to get a selfie with the lake in the background. "This light is incredible." Claire had been more focused on practical matters, checking our water supplies and making sure the RV's systems were working properly. "We're pretty isolated out here," she'd observed. "No cell service at all." "That's the point," Austin had said, cracking open a beer. "Sometimes you need to disconnect completely." But as the sun had begun to set, painting the cliffs in shades of orange and purple, I'd started to feel that something was watching us. It was probably just the unfamiliar environment, the way sound carried differently in the canyons, but I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often than usual. The feeling had only gotten stronger after dark. We'd built a fire and settled into our chairs with drinks and snacks, but conversation had become strained. Every few minutes, one of us would look up at some sound from the darkness, a splash in the water, a scrabble of rocks from the cliffs above, but we never saw anything. "Did you guys hear that?" Mia had asked around 10 o'clock, sitting up straighter in her chair. We'd all listened, but heard only the gentle lapping of water against the shore. "Hear what?" Austin had asked. It sounded like singing, really faint, but definitely a voice. We'd strained our ears, but the night had remained silent except for the distant hoot of an owl. "Probably just the wind in the rocks," Claire had said, but her voice had carried an edge of uncertainty. Or maybe it was a loon, I'd suggested. They can sound almost human sometimes. But Mia had shaken her head. No, this was different. It was like someone calling my name. That had been the first real chill of the trip, though none of us wanted to admit it at the time. We'd sat around the fire for another hour, but the easy camaraderie of the day had evaporated. Eventually, we'd doused the flames and retreated to the RV, where Austin had insisted on leaving the generator running all night to power the air conditioning. It gets cold in the desert, he'd explained, though the night was warm and still. I'd taken the convertible dinette bed, while Austin claimed the master bedroom in the back. Mia and Claire had converted the overhead bunk, and for a while, I'd listened to their quiet conversation drifting down from above. "Do you think that old man was trying to scare us?" Mia had whispered. "Probably just local superstition," Claire had replied. "Every remote area has its ghost stories, but I'd heard something in Claire's voice that suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. I'd finally drifted off to the sound of the generator and the gentle lapping of water against the shore, but my sleep had been restless and filled with strange dreams. I'd dreamed of the lake, but not as we'd seen it during the day. In my dreams, the water had been black and still, and shapes had moved beneath the surface, things too large and too wrong to be fish. I'd awakened several times during the night to sounds I couldn't identify, scratching at the RV's exterior walls, the soft squeak of footsteps on sand, and once, a sound that might have been whispering just outside the window above my head. Each time, I'd lain still and listened, but the sounds had always faded before I could be sure they'd been real. Morning had brought relief and embarrassment in equal measure. In the bright sunlight, our fears of the night before had seemed foolish. We'd made coffee and breakfast, taken turns in the tiny shower, and planned our day with the kind of forced enthusiasm that follows a sleepless night. "I want to explore some of those side canyons," Austin had announced, studying a topographic map over his eggs and bacon. "There are supposed to be some amazing slot canyons up that way. And I want to swim," Mia had added, already changed into her bikini. "That water looks incredible." Claire had been less enthusiastic. "Maybe we should stick together today. You know, buddy system." "Come on, Claire," Austin had laughed. "What's the worst that could happen? We're in the middle of nowhere. It's not like there are serial killers hiding behind every rock." But there had been something in the way he'd said it, too forceful, too insistent, that had made me wonder if he was trying to convince himself as much as us. In the end, we'd compromised. Austin and I would hike up to explore the slot canyons, while Mia and Claire stayed near the RV to swim and relax. We'd agreed to be back by sunset, and Austin had left his emergency whistle with Claire. "3 sharp blasts if you need us," he'd told her. "We'll come running." The hike had been spectacular. The slot canyons were everything the guidebooks had promised. Narrow corridors of smooth red stone that twisted and curved like the inside of a seashell. Light filtered down from above in shafts of gold and amber, and our voices had echoed strangely in the confined space. But as we'd climbed higher, I'd begun to feel that same sense of being watched that had troubled me the night before. Several times I'd turned to catch a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision, but there had never been anything there. "You feel that?" I'd asked Austin as we'd paused to rest in a small chamber where 3 canyons converged. "Feel what?" "Like we're not alone out here." Austin had laughed, but it had sounded forced. "You're getting spooked by the echo. These canyons can play tricks on your mind." But when he'd called out "hello" to demonstrate, the sound that had come back hadn't quite sounded like his voice. It had been close, but wrong somehow, the pitch slightly off, the rhythm just a beat too slow. We'd started heading back then, though neither of us had wanted to admit why. But the return trip had taken longer than expected. Paths that had been clear on the way up had seemed to branch and divide, leading us into dead ends and forcing us to backtrack. By the time we'd finally emerged from the canyons, the sun had been low on the horizon, painting the lake in shades of blood and fire. The RV had been visible from a quarter-mile away, sitting exactly where we'd left it in the small clearing beside the water. But something had looked wrong, even from that distance. It had taken me a moment to realize what. The awning was retracted, though we'd left it extended, and there were no signs of life around the campsite. "Where are they?" Austin had muttered, quickening his pace. We'd called out as we'd approached, but there had been no response. The RV's door had been closed, all the windows shut despite the warm evening. Austin had knocked before opening it, and we'd found Claire inside, sitting at the dinette with a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. "Where's Mia?" I'd asked immediately. Claire had looked up at us with an expression I'd never seen before. Blank, distant, like she was looking through us rather than at us. "She went for a swim," she'd said in a flat, monotone voice. "When?" "A while ago." Austin and I had exchanged glances. "How long ago, Claire?" "It's almost sunset." She'd blinked slowly, as if struggling to focus. "I don't." I was reading, and then I must have dozed off. When I woke up, she was gone. I'd felt the first real stab of fear then. Mia was a strong swimmer, but Lake Powell was enormous, with underwater hazards and unpredictable currents. And the water was cold, much colder than it looked. We'd searched the shoreline, calling her name until our voices were hoarse. Austin had even waded out chest deep, diving down to feel along the rocky bottom near where Claire thought she'd seen Mia enter the water. But there had been no sign of her. "We need to call for help," Claire had said when we'd finally returned to the RV as full darkness fell. But of course there had been no cell service, and the emergency radio we'd brought had produced nothing but static. "Maybe she swam around to one of the other coves," I'd suggested. Though even as I'd said it, I'd known it was unlikely. The nearest cove was over a mile away, and the water between was deep and dark. "We should wait," Austin had decided. "She knows this area. She studied the maps all week. She'll come back when she gets cold or tired." But Mia hadn't come back. Not that night. We'd taken turns staying awake, watching the water and listening for any sound that might indicate her return. The lake had remained perfectly still, reflecting the stars like a black mirror. Twice I'd thought I'd seen ripples moving across the surface. Too regular to be wind, too large to be fish. But when I'd pointed them out to the others, they'd seen nothing. Around 3 in the morning, Austin had suggested we motor the RV around the lake, searching the other coves and beaches. "She could be stranded somewhere," he'd said. "Maybe she got disoriented in the dark." But when he'd tried to start the engine, nothing had happened. The dashboard had lit up normally, all the gauges showing proper readings, but the motor had refused to turn over. We'd checked the batteries, the fuel levels, even the fuses, but everything had seemed fine. "It was running perfectly yesterday," Austin had muttered, his frustration evident. "Electronics can be finicky," Claire had said, though she'd sounded as puzzled as the rest of us. We'd spent the rest of the night in a tense vigil, drinking coffee and starting at every sound from outside. But the only noise had been the gentle washing of water against the shore, and occasionally, something that might have been wind through the canyon walls but sounded uncomfortably like distant voices. Dawn had brought no relief and no sign of Mia. The lake had stretched out before us, vast and empty, its surface broken only by the occasional jumping fish. We'd searched the shoreline again, this time more systematically, looking for any trace of where she might have gone. But the rocky beach had revealed nothing. No footprints, no disturbed sand, no pieces of her bright blue swimsuit. "We need to hike out and get help," Claire had said as we'd stood looking out over the water. "There's got to be a ranger station somewhere." But when we checked our maps, we'd discovered something that chilled me more than I'd wanted to admit. According to the topographic charts, we should have been able to see other parts of the lake from our vantage point. Other coves, other arms of water stretching between the red rock formations. But all we could see was our small bay, and beyond it, an unbroken expanse of desert and stone. "The maps must be wrong," Austin had said, but his voice had lacked conviction. "Or we're not where we think we are," I'd muttered. That second day had been the longest of my life. We'd tried everything we could think of, attempted to fix the RV's engine, searched every accessible inch of the cove, even built a signal fire on the highest point we could reach. But the engine had remained stubbornly dead, and our signal fire had produced a thin column of smoke that had seemed to dissipate far too quickly in the still air. As the sun had begun to set, painting the cliffs in familiar shades of red and gold, Claire had broken down completely. "She's dead," she'd sobbed, collapsing into one of our camp chairs. "She's dead, and it's my fault. I was supposed to watch her." "She's not dead," Austin had insisted, but his usual confidence had been cracked around the edges. "She's smart, she's tough. She'll figure out a way back." But even as he'd said it, I'd seen him scanning the water with the desperate intensity of someone who no longer believed his own words. We'd built another fire that night, bigger than before, and had arranged our chairs so we could watch both the water and the approaches to our campsite. The flames had danced and flickered in the still air, casting wild shadows on the RV's white walls. Around midnight, the fire had begun to burn blue. I'd noticed it first, a subtle shift in the color of the flames, from normal orange and yellow to an ethereal blue-white that seemed to give off less heat than it should have. I'd pointed it out to the others, and we'd all stared as the fire had continued to burn in that impossible color. "That's not normal," Claire had whispered. "Maybe there's copper in the driftwood," Austin had suggested. But we all knew that the wood we'd gathered had been ordinary desert scrub, nothing that should have burned blue. The fire had continued to burn that strange color for nearly an hour, and during that time we'd all heard it, the sound Mia had described the first night. Singing, faint but unmistakable, drifting across the water from somewhere far out on the lake. It had been a woman's voice, high and clear, singing what might have been a lullaby, but the melody had been wrong somehow, the notes hanging in the air longer than they should have, creating harmonies with themselves that made my teeth ache. "That's her," Austin had whispered, jumping up from his chair. "That's Mia. She's out there." But when he'd called her name, the singing had stopped immediately, leaving only silence and the blue flames of our impossible fire. We'd stood there for a long time, listening, but the voice hadn't returned. Eventually, the fire had faded back to normal colors and we'd reluctantly returned to the RV. None of us had slept that second night. The third day had dawned overcast and unnaturally quiet. Even the birds had seemed subdued, and the usual fish jumping in the lake had been noticeably absent. We'd continued our futile attempts to fix the RV and search for some trace of Mia, but our hearts hadn't really been in it. It was Claire who'd first noticed that our food was spoiling. She'd opened the refrigerator to make lunch and had found that the milk had curdled. The bread had grown a thick coat of green mold, and the fresh fruit had rotted to black mush. "This doesn't make sense," she'd said, holding up an apple that had been perfect the day before but was now soft and putrid. "The fridge is working fine. Look, the thermometer still says 38 degrees. But when Austin had checked the freezer, he'd found the same thing. Ice cream that had turned to soup, frozen vegetables that had become black slime, even the ice cubes that had somehow melted and refrozen into shapes that looked unsettlingly organic. "Food poisoning," I'd muttered, though I'd known it was a weak explanation. We should stick to canned goods. But when we'd opened the cabinets, we'd found that half our canned supplies had vanished entirely. Not eaten, not moved, just gone, as if they'd never existed at all. That afternoon, while Austin had made another futile attempt to start the engine, I decided to explore the cliff faces around our cove, looking for any sign of a trail that might lead back to civilization. The rock formations were beautiful but treacherous, full of hidden crevices and loose stones that threatened to send me tumbling into the lake below. It was while I was picking my way along a narrow ledge about 50 feet above the water that I'd found the first carving. It had been scratched into the red stone with something sharp, a crude but unmistakable drawing of a figure emerging from water. But it hadn't been the subject matter that had made my blood run cold. It had been the fresh scratches around it, forming letters that spelled out a single word: MIA. My hands had been shaking as I'd traced the letters with my finger. The scratches had been new, the stone dust still bright and unweathered. Someone had carved this recently, within the last day or two. But who? And how had they known her name? I'd climbed down quickly, my heart pounding, and had told the others about my discovery. But when I'd led them back to the spot, the carving had been gone. The rock face had been smooth and unmarked, as if nothing had ever been carved there at all. "You must have gotten turned around," Austin had said, though his voice had lacked conviction. "These cliffs all look the same." But I'd been certain of the location. I'd memorized the distinctive overhang above and the pattern of lichen on the rocks below. The carving had been there, I was sure of it. But now there was nothing. That third night, we'd decided not to build a fire. The blue flames and the singing had spooked us all, and none of us had wanted to risk another encounter with whatever was out there on the lake. Instead, we'd sat in the RV with all the lights on, playing cards and trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy. Around 11 o'clock, Claire had gone to use the bathroom, and Austin and I had been deep in a game of gin rummy when we'd heard her scream. We'd both rushed to the back of the RV, where we'd found Claire standing in front of the bathroom mirror, her face pale and her hands shaking. "What happened?" I'd asked. "The mirror," she'd whispered. "Look at the mirror." I'd looked, but had seen only our three reflections staring back at us. "What about it?" "There was someone else," she'd said, "standing behind me. A woman with long dark hair and no eyes." Austin and I had exchanged glances. "Claire, you're exhausted. We all are. Sometimes—" "I know what I saw," she'd snapped, her voice rising to near hysteria. She was right there, reaching for me, and her face— God, her face was rotting. We'd spent the next hour searching every inch of the RV, looking for any sign that someone else had been inside. But the doors had been locked, the windows secured, and there had been no evidence of any intrusion. "Stress can cause hallucinations," I'd said gently, trying to comfort Claire. "We're all under a lot of pressure." But even as I'd said it, I'd remembered the carving that had appeared and disappeared, and I'd wondered if we were dealing with something that couldn't be explained by stress and exhaustion. The fourth day had been when everything had started to fall apart completely. We'd awakened to find that our water tank was empty, despite having filled it completely just 3 days before. The gauge had shown empty, and when Austin had checked the external connections, no water had come out. "There must be a leak," he'd said, crawling under the RV to examine the plumbing. But he'd found nothing. No wet spots, no puddles, no signs that the water had ever existed. "This is impossible," Claire had said, her voice tight with the kind of control that comes just before a complete breakdown. Water doesn't just disappear. But it had, and we'd been forced to ration what little bottled water we had left while we'd debated our options. "We need to leave," Claire had said for the dozenth time. "We need to hike out and get help." "And abandon Mia?" Austin had shot back. "What if she comes back and we're not here?" "What if she doesn't come back at all?" Claire had countered. "What if she's already—" "Don't," Austin had cut her off. "Don't say it." But we'd all been thinking it. 3 days was too long. Even if Mia had somehow gotten stranded in another cove, she would have found a way to signal us by now. The silence from the lake had been complete and absolute. It was that afternoon, while we'd been sitting in the shade of the RV's awning and trying to decide what to do next, that she'd finally returned. I'd been the first to see her, a distant figure emerging from the water at the far end of the cove. She'd been walking slowly, deliberately, her long, dark hair streaming with water and her movements strangely fluid. "Mia!" Austin had shouted, jumping up from his chair. "Mia, over here!" But she hadn't responded to his call. She'd just continued walking, her bare feet making no sound on the rocky beach. As she'd gotten closer, I'd been able to see that she was still wearing her blue bikini, though it had looked different somehow. Darker, as if stained with something other than water. "Jesus, Mia, where have you been?" Claire had called out, relief evident in her voice. "We've been worried sick." But Mia hadn't answered. She'd just kept walking toward us with that same slow, measured pace, her head tilted at an angle that had made my skin crawl. It wasn't until she'd been about 20 feet away that I'd gotten my first clear look at her face, and that was when I'd known with absolute certainty that whatever was walking toward us, it wasn't really Mia. The features had been right. The same green eyes, the same full lips, the same small scar above her left eyebrow from a childhood accident. But the expression had been completely wrong. Her face had been blank, emotionless, except for a smile that had been too wide and too fixed, showing far too many teeth. And her eyes had been looking in different directions. One focused on us while the other had tracked something invisible in the sky above our heads. "Mia, Austin had said uncertainly, taking a step backward. "Are you okay?" She'd finally spoken then, but her voice had been wrong too, flat and hollow, like an echo of an echo. "I'm fine," she'd said, still smiling that horrible smile. "I went swimming. The water is so deep here. So very deep." "We've been looking for you for 3 days," I'd said, my mouth suddenly dry. "Where have you been?" Her head had tilted further, almost to her shoulder, and that mismatched gaze had fixed on me. "Time moves differently in the deep water," she'd said. "I met such interesting people down there. They told me stories." Claire had moved closer to me, her hand finding my arm. "Mia, you're scaring us. Maybe you should sit down, have some water." "Water," Mia had repeated and had begun to laugh. It had been a sound like glass breaking, sharp and wrong and utterly inhuman. Yes, I should definitely have some water. She'd walked past us then, heading for the RV with that same measured pace. But as she'd passed, I'd caught a smell that had made my stomach lurch. The stench of stagnant water and rotting vegetation like the bottom of a pond that hadn't seen sunlight in years. Austin had started to follow her, but I'd grabbed his arm. "Don't," I'd whispered. "That's not her." "What are you talking about? Of course it's her." But even as he'd said it, I'd seen doubt creeping into his eyes, because up close the wrongness had been undeniable. Her skin had been too pale, with a grayish tint that had suggested something dead and waterlogged. Her movements had been too fluid, like she'd been floating rather than walking. And that smell. "She's been in the water for 3 days, Claire had whispered. "Look at her fingertips." I'd looked and had seen what she meant. Mia's fingers had been wrinkled and white, the skin puckered and beginning to slough off. But it hadn't been the normal pruning that comes from extended time in water. It had been the kind of decomposition that takes weeks. We'd followed her to the RV, but had hesitated at the door. Inside, we'd been able to hear her moving around, opening cabinets and drawers with an odd, purposeful intensity. "What are you looking for?" Austin had called through the screen door. "Something sharp," she'd replied in that hollow voice. "I need something sharp." That was when we'd run. We'd grabbed what supplies we could carry, water bottles, a flashlight, the first aid kit, and had started hiking back toward the main road. It had been nearly dark, and the terrain had been treacherous, but staying near the RV had no longer been an option. Behind us, we'd heard the RV's door slam open, and that horrible laugh had echoed across the water. "Where are you going?" Mia's voice had called after us. We were just getting reacquainted, but we'd kept climbing, scrambling up the rocky slope that led away from the cove. Austin had led the way, his usual bravado replaced by grim determination. Claire had been breathing hard, unused to the physical exertion, but she'd kept pace without complaint. I'd brought up the rear, glancing back frequently to make sure we weren't being followed. But the cove had remained still and quiet, the RV's windows glowing yellow in the gathering darkness. We'd climbed for nearly an hour before stopping to rest on a flat shelf of rock overlooking the lake. The cove where we'd camped had been visible far below, a small crescent of dark water surrounded by towering walls of stone. The RV had looked like a toy from that height, its lights barely visible in the vast darkness. "How far do you think it is to the main road?" Claire had asked, wiping sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. "Can't be more than 5 or 6 miles, Austin had replied, though he'd sounded less certain than usual. "We'll be there by morning." But that was when I'd noticed something that had made my blood run cold. There, far below us on the beach beside the RV, had been a figure. It had been too distant to make out clearly, but it had been moving with that same fluid, unnatural gait that had characterized Mia's return from the water. "Look," I'd whispered, pointing down at the cove. The others had followed my gaze, and we'd all watched as the figure had raised one arm and begun to wave at us. Even from that distance, I'd been able to see the pale gleam of teeth in a too-wide smile. "She knows. We're here," Claire had said, her voice barely audible. "How is that possible?" Austin had asked. "We're hundreds of feet up." But as we'd watched, the figure had begun to climb. Not along the established trail we'd taken, but straight up the cliff face, moving with an impossible speed and agility that had defied every law of physics I'd known. "Run," I'd said. We'd run. The next several hours had been a nightmare of stumbling through darkness, following game trails and dry washes that had seemed to branch and divide without reason. Our flashlight had begun to dim after the first hour, and we'd been forced to conserve the batteries, using it only when absolutely necessary to navigate particularly treacherous sections. Behind us, always behind us, we'd heard the sound of pursuit. Not footsteps exactly, but something moving through the brush with a liquid grace that had suggested something that belonged in water rather than on land. "This way," Austin had whispered at one point, leading us into a narrow canyon that had promised concealment. But the canyon had ended in a sheer wall, forcing us to backtrack. And when we'd emerged, we'd found fresh scratches in the sand, symbols that had looked disturbingly similar to the carving I'd seen on the cliff face. Dawn had found us exhausted and disoriented, huddled in a small cave we'd discovered in the side of a wash. We'd taken turns sleeping in 2-hour shifts, one person always awake to watch for signs of pursuit. It was during Claire's watch that the thing wearing Mia's face had found us. I'd awakened to Claire's terrified whimpering and had opened my eyes to see a figure crouched at the mouth of the cave. In the dim, pre-dawn light, it had looked like Mia, the same dark hair, the same slender build. But there had been something fundamentally wrong with the way it had held itself, like a marionette being manipulated by an inexperienced puppeteer. "I've been looking everywhere for you," it had said in Mia's voice, though the words had seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her throat. "Why did you leave me?" Austin had awakened then, and I'd seen his face go through the same progression of hope, recognition, and growing horror that I'd experienced. "Mia," he'd said carefully, "where have you been?" "Swimming," she'd replied, still crouched in that unnatural position. "Learning. The deep water has so much to teach." "You've been gone for 3 days," Claire had said, her voice shaking. "We thought you were dead." The thing had tilted its head, considering this. "Dead?" it had said, and had begun to laugh again. "No, not dead. Changed. Improved. Would you like to see?" Before any of us could respond, it had begun to move. But instead of standing up like a normal person, it had unfolded itself, revealing joints that bent in directions they shouldn't have and limbs that seemed too long for the body they belonged to. That was when Austin had screamed. The sound had echoed through the canyon, and the thing had reacted by moving faster than anything human should have been able to move. In an instant, it had been inside the cave with us, and I'd gotten my first close look at what Mia had become. Her skin had been the color of lake water, pale green with darker mottling that had suggested decomposition. Her hair had been full of weeds and small stones, and when she'd smiled, I'd seen that her teeth had been replaced by rows of needle-sharp points that had looked more suited to a deep-water predator than a human being. But worst of all had been her eyes. They'd been completely black, like pools of oil, and they'd reflected the dim light in a way that had suggested they weren't entirely solid anymore. "Don't be afraid," she'd said, reaching out with fingers that had been webbed and tipped with claws. "The water is calling you too. Can't you hear it?" And the terrible thing was, I could. Faintly, at the very edge of perception, I'd heard something that might have been music drifting up from the direction of the lake. It had been beautiful and hypnotic, and part of me had wanted nothing more than to follow it down to the water's edge. But Claire had grabbed my arm, her fingernails digging into my skin, and the spell had been broken. "We need to go," she'd hissed. "Now." We'd scrambled out of the cave, leaving our supplies behind in our haste to escape. The thing that had been Mia had followed, but its movements had become jerky and unnatural once it had been exposed to direct sunlight, as if the light had been painful or disorienting. "You can't run forever," it had called after us, its voice echoing strangely in the morning air. "The lake is everywhere. Eventually you'll have to come back to the water." We'd climbed higher into the desert, following what had looked like an old mining road that had wound between massive red boulders and through stands of gnarled juniper trees. The sun had been merciless, and without adequate water, we'd all begun to show signs of dehydration within hours. "We're going to die out here," Claire had said as we'd paused in the meager shade of an overhanging rock. "Even if we find the main road, we're miles from anywhere." "No," Austin had said, though his usual optimism had sounded strained. "Someone will come looking for us eventually. when we don't show up for work on Monday. That's 3 days away, I'd pointed out. We'll never last that long without water, but Austin had refused to give up. There, he'd said, pointing to a distant ridge. I can see power lines. That means there's a road, maybe even a town. The power lines had been real. Thin, black lines sketched against the blue sky. But they'd been much further away than they'd appeared, and the terrain between us and them had been brutal. A maze of canyons and washes that had seemed designed to trap and confuse travelers. We'd been picking our way down into a particularly deep wash when Austin had stopped suddenly, his hand raised for silence. "Do you hear that?" he'd whispered. We'd all listened and had gradually become aware of a sound drifting up from somewhere ahead of us, the distinctive hum of an RV generator. "Someone else is camping down there," Claire had said, hope creeping into her voice for the first time in days. But as we'd gotten closer, the sound had become more familiar, and I'd felt my stomach drop as I'd recognized the particular pitch and rhythm of our own generator. We'd climbed to the edge of the wash and had looked down to see our own RV sitting in a clearing beside a small pool of water. Everything had been exactly as we'd left it 4 days ago. The retracted awning, the dead fire ring, even our abandoned camp chairs still arranged around the cold ashes. "That's impossible," Austin had breathed. "We've been walking away from the lake for hours." But there it had been, undeniable and terrifying. Somehow, despite our best efforts to escape, we'd walked in a massive circle and had ended up right back where we'd started. And there, sitting in one of our camp chairs as if she'd been waiting for us, had been Mia. She'd looked more human than she had in the cave, though the wrongness had still been apparent to anyone who'd looked closely. Her skin had retained that pale, mottled appearance, and her movements had been too smooth, too fluid. But the most disturbing thing had been her expression, patient and knowing, like a predator that had finally cornered its prey. "Welcome back," she'd said as we'd approached. "I was beginning to think you'd gotten lost." "How?" Austin had demanded. "How are we back here?" "All paths lead to the water," she'd replied, standing up from the chair with that liquid grace. "Especially for those who belong in the deep places." That was when I'd noticed what she'd been doing while she'd waited for us. Arranged around the campsite had been our missing supplies, the vanished canned goods, the rotted food from the refrigerator, even personal items we'd left in the RV. But everything had been wrong, transformed in subtle but disturbing ways. The canned goods had been opened and emptied, their contents arranged in patterns that had hurt to look at directly. The rotted food had been sculpted into shapes that had suggested faces, or perhaps things that were trying to become faces. And our personal belongings had been arranged in neat lines, like grave goods prepared for a burial. "What did you do?" Claire had whispered. "I prepared," Mia had answered. "The deep ones have such specific requirements." Before any of us could ask what she'd meant, she'd moved. One moment she'd been standing 10 feet away, the next she'd been right in front of Austin, her webbed hands pressed against his chest. Austin had tried to step back, but his feet had seemed to stick to the ground as if the sand beneath them had turned to quicksand. "Mia, please," he'd said. "It's me. It's Austin. Remember?" "I remember," she'd said, and her voice had carried harmonics that had made my bones vibrate. "I remember everything, including how you always wanted to go deeper." Her hands had begun to glow with a phosphorescent light, and where they'd touched Austin's shirt, the fabric had started to dissolve. Beneath it, his skin had begun to take on the same pale, mottled appearance that had marked Mia's transformation. "No!" Claire had screamed, rushing forward, but when she'd tried to grab Mia's arm, her hand had passed right through it, as if Mia had been made of water rather than flesh. Austin had begun to convulse, his back arching as something had moved beneath his skin. His eyes had rolled back, showing only white, and foam had bubbled from his mouth. "The deep water calls," Mia had said, her voice now carrying the sound of rushing currents. "It's time to answer." That was when I'd seen them. Shapes moving beneath the surface of the small pool beside our campsite. Not fish, but things that might once have been human, their pale forms writhing and dancing in the dark water. And I'd understood then what had happened to Mia, what was happening to Austin, and what would happen to Claire and me if we didn't act quickly. I'd grabbed Claire's hand and had run for the RV. Behind us, Austin's screams had grown higher and more desperate until they'd no longer sounded human at all. The RV's engine had started immediately this time, roaring to life as if it had never been broken. I'd thrown it into gear and had gunned the accelerator, sending us lurching forward across the rough ground. In the rearview mirror, I'd seen Mia standing beside Austin's convulsing form, her arms raised toward the sky. The water in the pool had begun to bubble and churn, and more shapes had been emerging from its depths, things that had been human once but had been changed by whatever lived in the deep places of the lake. "Drive!" Claire had screamed. "Just drive!" But as we'd rounded the first bend in the access road, our headlights had illuminated something that had made my blood freeze. There, standing in the middle of the narrow track, had been Austin. He'd looked completely normal. Same clothes, same face, same easy smile. If I hadn't just left him behind in Mia's phosphorescent grip, I would have stopped immediately. "Derek, wait," he'd called out, raising his hands. "It's me. I got away. Don't leave me here." I'd hesitated for just a moment, my foot hovering over the brake pedal. But then I'd seen his eyes in the headlights' glare, black and reflective like pools of oil, and I'd known that whatever was standing in our path, it wasn't Austin anymore. I'd hit the gas instead of the brakes. The thing had leaped aside at the last second, moving with inhuman speed and agility. In the side mirror, I'd seen it watching us go, still wearing Austin's face but standing in a posture no human spine could achieve. "Oh, God," Claire had whispered beside me. "Oh, God. Oh, God. Oh, God." The road out had seemed longer than the road in, winding through canyons that I didn't remember from our arrival. The GPS had been completely useless, showing our location as somewhere in the middle of the lake itself, hundreds of feet underwater. But eventually we'd seen lights ahead, the blessed glow of civilization. A small town had appeared around a bend in the road, just a handful of buildings clustered around a gas station and a diner, but it had looked like paradise after the horrors of the lake. I'd pulled into the gas station and had sat for a moment with the engine running, hardly able to believe we'd made it. Beside me, Claire had been crying quietly, her face buried in her hands. "We need to call the police," she'd said. "Tell them about Mia and Austin." "And tell them what?" I'd asked. "That our friends were possessed by lake monsters?" She'd looked at me then, and I'd seen my own haunted expression reflected in her eyes. Then what do we do? I'd had no answer for that. How do you explain something that defies explanation? How do you mourn friends who might still be alive, but changed into something that wore their faces like masks? We'd bought gas and water and had called the authorities from the payphone outside the diner. But when the park rangers had gone to investigate, they'd found no trace of our campsite. The cove was there, exactly as described, but there had been no RV, no supplies, no evidence that anyone had ever camped there at all. "Must have been a different cove," the ranger had told us kindly. "Lake Powell has hundreds of them. Easy to get confused." But I'd known it had been the right place. I'd memorized every detail of those red rock walls, every curve of that crescent beach. Our friends were still there somewhere, in the deep water where time moved differently and old things waited with infinite patience. Claire and I had driven back to Denver in silence, taking turns at the wheel and stopping only when absolutely necessary. We'd tried to return to our normal lives, but normal had become a foreign concept. Claire had quit her job at the newspaper and had moved back in with her parents in Ohio. I'd lasted another month at my marketing firm before the confines of the office had become unbearable. That was 6 months ago. Since then, I've traveled constantly, never staying in one place for more than a few weeks. I tell people I'm a freelance photographer now, documenting remote locations for travel magazines. But the truth is, I can't stay away from water. Not because I want to. God knows I never want to see another lake or river as long as I live, but because I have to keep moving, have to keep checking. Because sometimes, in quiet moments when I'm not expecting it, I hear Mia's voice calling my name. The postcards started arriving about a month after our return. They're always postmarked from small towns near lakes and rivers, Lake Champlain in Vermont, Crater Lake in Oregon, the Finger Lakes in New York. The images on the front are always the same. Pristine water surrounded by beautiful scenery, the kind of photos that fill tourism brochures. But it's the messages on the back that keep me awake at night. The water misses you. M. Austin says hello. He's learning to breathe underwater. M. Such deep water here. Perfect for swimming. You should visit. M. The handwriting is definitely Mia's. I've compared it to old birthday cards and notes she'd left me over the years. But the paper is always damp when the postcards arrive, and they smell like stagnant water and rotting vegetation. Claire gets them too. She called me last week, sobbing, to tell me about the latest one. It had been postmarked from a town in Minnesota near the Boundary Waters. The message had been longer than usual. Claire, you were always the smart one. You know this isn't over. The deep places are calling, and eventually everyone has to answer. Save yourself the trouble of running. Find the nearest lake and just walk in. It's so much easier if you don't fight it. The water is warm here, and we're all waiting for you. Love and deep currents, Mia. I'd booked a flight to Minneapolis that same day. I found the lake 3 days later, a small, unnamed body of water hidden in the dense forests of northern Minnesota. The locals in the nearest town, if you could call a gas station and a bait shop a town, had been reluctant to give me directions. Not much up there, the man behind the counter had said when I'd asked about lakes in the area. Just Heron Lake, and nobody goes there anymore. Why not? He'd shrugged, but I'd caught the way his eyes had flickered toward the window, as if he'd been checking to make sure no one was listening. Fishing's no good, water's funny. Funny how? Just funny. You'd be better off trying Pine Lake about 10 miles south. Good bass fishing there. But I'd pressed him for directions to Heron Lake, and eventually he'd given them to me, along with a look that had suggested he thought I was making a serious mistake. The lake had been everything I'd feared and more. It was small, maybe half a mile across, surrounded by dense stands of pine and birch that had blocked out most of the afternoon light. The water had been perfectly still and so dark it had looked like polished obsidian. There had been no signs of current camping, but along the shoreline I'd found evidence of old fires and the rusted remains of what might once have been a dock. And, scratched into the bark of a massive pine tree, I'd found a message. Derek. October 15th. The water is warm. M. October 15th. That had been yesterday. I'd stood there staring at the message, my hands shaking as I'd tried to process what it meant. How had she known I would be there? How had she known exactly when I would arrive? But even as I'd asked myself these questions, I'd heard it. Faint singing drifting across the water. The same melody I'd heard that night at Lake Powell when our fire had burned blue. And I'd seen her then, far out on the lake, her head barely visible above the dark surface. She'd been watching me, and even from that distance, I'd been able to see the pale gleam of her impossible smile. She'd begun to swim toward shore then, her movements creating no wake, no ripples on the still surface. I'd known I should run, should get back in my rental car and drive as far and as fast as possible. But the singing had been so beautiful, so hypnotic, and my feet had seemed rooted to the muddy shore. It wasn't until she'd been close enough for me to see the phosphorescent glow beneath her skin that I'd finally broken free of the spell. I'd turned and had run for the car, crashing through the underbrush and nearly falling twice before reaching the narrow dirt road where I'd parked. The engine had started immediately, and I'd driven away without looking back. But in my rearview mirror, I'd seen a pale figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching me go. That was yesterday. Now I'm in a motel room in Duluth, writing this all down while I still remember the details clearly, because I'm starting to forget things. Small details at first, but important ones. Like the exact color of Austin's eyes, or the sound of Claire's laugh, or what Mia looked like before the lake changed her. The forgetting is spreading, and I think I know why. The water isn't done with me yet. It's patient, but persistent, and it knows that eventually I'll have to sleep. And when I sleep, I dream of deep water and old things that have been waiting for so very long. I can hear singing outside my window now, faint but growing stronger. The melody is familiar. The same lullaby I've been hearing for months. the one that calls to something deep and primal in my brain. There's a pool at this motel, just visible from my room, and the water is probably warm and inviting. Claire called an hour ago. She was crying, but there had been something else in her voice. Relief, maybe, or acceptance. I found her postcard, she'd said, the one from Minnesota. But Derek, the postmark date is from tomorrow. She knew we'd be here before we did. Where are you? I'd asked. Does it matter? There's water everywhere, Derek. Lakes and rivers and streams and even that little fountain in the park where I used to feed the ducks when I was a kid. She's in all of it now, waiting. The line had gone quiet then, and when I'd called her name, a different voice had answered. Familiar but wrong, like an echo from the bottom of a well. Derek, it had said in Mia's hollow tones. Claire's gone swimming. She'll be so much happier now. The deep water has room for everyone. I'd hung up then, but the phone had rung again immediately. And again. And again. Each time I'd answered, hoping against hope that it would be Claire's voice, normal and human and alive. But it had always been Mia, and each time she'd sounded more like herself and less like the thing from the lake. You can't run forever, she'd said during the last call. The water is calling you home. She's right, of course. I can feel it now, that pull toward the deep places. It's in my blood, in my bones, in the spaces between my thoughts. The postcards were never a threat. They were an invitation, a promise that the loneliness would end, that the running would finally be over. Outside my window, the motel pool glows blue in the darkness, and I can see shapes moving beneath the surface. They're beautiful in their way, graceful and ancient and utterly alien, and they're waiting for me with infinite patience because they know what I'm only beginning to understand. Some calls can't be ignored forever. The water is warm here. Mia was right about that. And the singing is so beautiful, so hypnotic, that it makes everything else seem unimportant. My memories of the surface world are fading like dreams, replaced by visions of vast underwater cities where the laws of physics don't apply and time moves like honey. I can see my friends down here in the deep places. Austin waves to me from a grove of kelp that grows in formations too regular to be natural. Claire dances among schools of fish that shimmer with their own internal light. And Mia smiles and beckons me deeper, toward the places where the water becomes thick as blood and the pressure would crush any merely human body. But I'm not merely human anymore. None of us are. We're something else now. Something better adapted to these deep, dark places where the old ones wait and dream. The surface world seems so far away now, so irrelevant. Why did we ever think that shallow existence was worth preserving? Here in the deep waters, there are wonders beyond imagination, secrets that have been hidden since the world was young. And the singing. God. The singing is everywhere now. A chorus of voices that have learned to harmonize with the rhythm of currents and tides. It's the most beautiful sound I've ever heard, and it's calling me deeper, always deeper, toward the places where light has never penetrated and time has no meaning. I understand now why the locals warned us, not because they wanted to keep us away from the lake, but because they knew we wouldn't be able to resist its call. They'd seen others like us, surface dwellers who thought they could visit the deep places and return unchanged. But the water remembers everyone who enters it, and eventually the water always calls them home. The singing is getting louder now, and I can feel my body changing, adapting to its new environment. My lungs are learning to extract oxygen from water instead of air, and my eyes are developing the ability to see in the absolute darkness of the deepest trenches. Soon, I'll join the others in their endless dance through the underwater canyons and forgotten cities. We'll sing together, our voices carrying across the deep currents to call others to join us. Because the water is always hungry for new voices, new dancers, new residents for its hidden kingdoms. And someday, when other surface dwellers come to visit the beautiful, pristine lakes and rivers of the world, they'll hear our song drifting across the water in the quiet hours before dawn. They'll feel the same pull that drew us down into the deep places. The same irresistible call that promises answers to questions they didn't even know they had. They'll tell themselves it's just the wind, just their imagination, just the effects of being too long in the wilderness. But deep down, they'll know the truth that we learned too late. All water is connected, and in the deepest places, old things dream of new companions. The water is calling you too. Can you hear it? Can you hear us singing? Author's note: this account was found on the computer of Derek Spencer, who disappeared from a Duluth motel in October 2025. The motel's pool was found to contain an unusually high concentration of lake sediment, though the source of the contamination remains unknown. Claire Cross was reported missing from her parents' home in Ohio the same week. Neither Mia Hart nor Austin Perry have been seen since their reported disappearance at Lake Powell in Utah. All 4 individuals were last known to be traveling together in a rented RV that was never recovered. Story 3. We should have never gone to Gifford Pinchot Forest. I'm Sarah Martinez. I was 42 back then. And this is the story of how I lost everything. The RV had been David's idea, of course. My husband always thought he could solve our family's problems with another vacation, another adventure, another chance to reconnect. Our marriage had been hanging by threads since his affair came to light 6 months earlier, and our kids, Emma, 19, and Jake, 17, barely spoke to either of us anymore. They communicated in eye rolls and heavy sighs, their faces permanently lit by phone screens that provided better company than their parents. "Come on, Sarah," David had said, spreading out the Washington State camping guide on our kitchen table like he was planning a military operation. "Remember when we used to love camping? Before the kids, before everything got so complicated?" I remembered. I remembered a lot of things David seemed to have forgotten. But here we were, 3 weeks later, our 30-foot Winnebago crawling up a narrow Forest Service road deep in the Cascade Mountains. The October rain drummed against the windshield in a steady rhythm that made my temples throb. Outside, Douglas firs pressed in on both sides like dark sentinels, their branches so thick they blocked out most of the gray afternoon sky. "This is so stupid," Emma muttered from the dinette behind us, not looking up from her phone. "There's no cell service up here. What if there's an emergency?" "That's the point, honey," David said, his knuckles white on the steering wheel as he navigated another switchback. "To disconnect, to be present with each other." Jake snorted. "Yeah, because being trapped in a metal box with you two is exactly what I wanted to do with my fall break." I watched David's jaw clench. The temperature in the RV seemed to drop a few degrees. "Jake," I said quietly, "your father's trying to—" "I know what he's trying to do," Jake interrupted. "Same thing he always does. Pretend everything's fine and hope we'll all forget about—" "That's enough," David snapped. The silence that followed was broken only by the rain and the labored whine of the engine climbing the steep grade. I stared out at the endless trees and wondered if this trip was going to finish destroying what was left of our family, or if there was nothing left to destroy. The GPS had lost signal 20 minutes ago, leaving us to follow increasingly dubious Forest Service signs. David insisted he knew where we were going. Sunset Campground, a remote spot he'd found online that promised authentic wilderness camping with RV hookups. The website had been sparse on details, just a grainy photo of a clearing surrounded by old-growth forest and a phone number that went straight to voicemail. "There," David said, pointing through the windshield. "Finally." I looked up to see a weathered wooden sign hanging at a crooked angle. Sunset Campground. Elevation 4200 FT. An arrow pointed left down what looked more like a logging road than a campground entrance. As we turned, the wheels crunched over broken glass and something that might have been pottery shards. I frowned. "David, are you sure this is—" "It'll be fine," he said, but his voice had lost some of its forced enthusiasm. The road wound deeper into the forest for another half-mile before opening into a circular clearing about the size of a football field. Ancient firs ringed the space like cathedral columns, their trunks easily 6 feet in diameter. In the center of the clearing sat a stone fire ring, but something was wrong with it. Instead of being round, it formed a perfect pentagon. and the stones weren't the usual river rocks you'd expect. They were carved granite blocks, each one inscribed with symbols I didn't recognize. "Weird fire pit," Emma said, finally looking up from her phone. She'd been trying to get signal for the past hour, holding her device up to windows like some kind of electronic divining rod. David parked the RV near the tree line and killed the engine. The sudden silence was oppressive. No birds, no insects, no wind through the branches. Just the tick of cooling metal and the faint patter of rain on the roof. "Where are the hookups?" I asked, looking around the empty clearing. There were no electrical pedestals, no water spigots, no dump station. This didn't look like an RV campground at all. "They must be around here somewhere," David said, but he was frowning too. He grabbed his jacket and headed for the door. "I'll take a look around." While David searched for the non-existent hookups, I helped the kids set up inside the RV. Emma claimed the dinette for homework she had no intention of doing, while Jake retreated to the back bedroom with his gaming laptop, hoping our inverter would hold out longer than our generator fuel. I was organizing the kitchen when I heard David calling my name from outside. His voice sounded strange, higher pitched than normal, with an edge of excitement that made my stomach twist. I stepped outside to find him standing near the tree line, about 50 yards from our campsite. He was staring at something just inside the forest. "Sarah, you need to see this," he called, beckoning me over. I pulled my rain jacket tighter and walked toward him, my boots squelching in the muddy ground. As I got closer, I could see what had caught his attention. A narrow path leading into the forest, marked on both sides by stakes driven into the ground. Each stake was topped with what looked like a bundle of sticks and dried grass, tied with leather cord. "Trail markers," David said, "but look at them closely." I stepped closer and immediately wished I hadn't. The bundles weren't just sticks and grass. Woven throughout were small bones. Bird bones, maybe, or rodent. And hanging from thin threads were what looked like teeth. Human teeth. "We should go," I said immediately. "This isn't a normal campground, David. Something's wrong here." But David was already walking down the path, his phone out, taking pictures. "This is incredible," he called back. "It's like some kind of Native American trail, or maybe modern art installation. Emma would love this for her anthropology project." "David, stop." I hurried after him, but he was already 20 feet down the path. The trees here were even larger, their canopy so thick that it was nearly dark despite being mid-afternoon. "We're leaving. Now." He turned back to me, and for a moment his face looked different. Younger, maybe, or more excited than I'd seen him in years. "Come on, Sarah. When's the last time we discovered something together? Really discovered something?" Before I could answer, we heard Emma screaming. We ran back toward the RV, David crashing through the underbrush beside the path while I stuck to the muddy trail. Emma was standing outside the RV door, pointing toward the forest on the opposite side of the clearing. "There's someone in the trees," she said, her voice shaking. "Just standing there, watching us." I followed her gaze but saw nothing except dark trunks and deeper shadows. "Where?" "Right there," she pointed again, more frantically. "By that big tree with the broken top. They're wearing something white like a dress or a robe." David squinted into the forest. "I don't see anything, honey." "They were there," Emma insisted. "A woman, I think. She was just staring, and she didn't move when I waved." Jake appeared in the RV doorway, his gaming headset around his neck. "What's all the shouting about?" "Nothing," David said quickly. "Emma thought she saw someone, but—" "I did see someone," Emma said, her voice rising. "Just because you can't see her doesn't mean she wasn't there." I looked back at the tree line, scanning the shadows between the massive trunks. The forest was still silent. No birds, no squirrels, no wind. It was like the whole place was holding its breath. "Maybe we should find another campground," I suggested. "Somewhere with actual amenities." David's expression hardened. "We're not leaving, Sarah. We just got here. We're going to have a nice family camping trip, damn it, even if it kills us." The words hung in the air like a curse. That first night, I barely slept. Every sound from outside the RV seemed amplified. The drip of rain from the trees, the creak of branches, what might have been footsteps circling our campsite. David snored beside me, oblivious while I lay awake listening to the forest breathe. Around 3 a.m., I heard singing. It was faint at first, barely audible over the rain, but as I strained to listen, it grew clearer. A woman's voice, high and sweet, singing something that sounded like a lullaby. But the words weren't in English. They flowed together in long, liquid syllables that seemed to bypass my ears and resonate directly in my bones. I sat up and peered through the small bedroom window. The fire ring in the center of the clearing was glowing. Not with flames, but with a soft, pulsing light that emanated from the stones themselves. And around it, barely visible in the darkness, figures moved in a slow circle. I counted at least a dozen of them, maybe more. They wore long robes or dresses that trailed on the ground, and they moved with perfect synchronization, their arms raised toward the sky. In the center of the ring, something dark writhed on the ground. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was impossible. We were alone out here. David had made sure of that, driving us to the most remote campground he could find. Where had these people come from? The singing grew louder, and I could see more details now. The figures were all women, their hair long and unbound, their faces turned upward toward the rain. They moved clockwise around the fire ring, and with each step, the light from the stones pulsed brighter. I reached over to shake David awake, but my hand froze halfway to his shoulder, because one of the figures had stopped singing and was looking directly at our RV. Even through the rain and darkness, I could see her face clearly. She was young, maybe Emma's age, with pale skin and dark eyes that seemed to reflect the light from the stones. She smiled at me. A wide, warm smile that should have been reassuring, but instead filled me with cold terror. Then she raised one hand and waved. I jerked back from the window so hard I nearly fell off the bed. When I looked again, the clearing was empty. The stones were dark. The only sound was rain on the roof. But on the glass, exactly where the girl had been looking, was a handprint. On the inside. I didn't tell David about the ritual. How could I? He was already so invested in this trip, so determined to fix our family with forced togetherness and wilderness therapy. And part of me wondered if I'd dreamed it. The handprint was gone by morning, and in daylight the stone fire ring looked ordinary. Just weathered granite blocks arranged by some previous camper. Emma was still convinced she'd seen someone in the trees the day before. But after David made coffee and Jake found a decent walking trail behind our campsite, the mood lifted slightly. We spent the morning exploring, David pointing out different tree species and rock formations while the kids trudged behind us with the resigned expressions of prisoners on a work detail. The trail was well maintained but unmarked, winding deeper into the forest along what might have been an old creek bed. The trees here were enormous, some of the biggest I'd ever seen, and draped with moss that hung like funeral shrouds. Everything smelled of rain and decay and something else, something sweeter that reminded me unpleasantly of overripe fruit. We'd been hiking for maybe an hour when Jake stopped abruptly. "Do you guys hear that?" he asked. We all listened. At first, I heard nothing except our own breathing and the drip of water from the canopy. Then, very faintly, came the sound of voices. Not words exactly, but a rhythmic chanting that seemed to drift through the trees from somewhere ahead. "Probably other campers," David said, but he didn't sound convinced. We followed the trail toward the sound, and after another 10 minutes of walking, the forest opened into a small meadow. In the center was a circle of standing stones, each one about 7 feet tall and covered with the same symbols I'd seen on the fire ring. The chanting was louder here, but I still couldn't see who was making it. Emma pulled out her phone and started recording. "This is so cool," she said. "It's like Stonehenge, but in Washington." David walked to the nearest stone and ran his fingers over the carved symbols. "These look old," he said. "Really old. Pre-Columbian, maybe. Or someone's art project," I said, fighting the urge to grab my family and run back to the RV. "We should go. This feels like private property." But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. This place felt ancient, untouched, sacred, and we were intruding. Jake had wandered to the far side of the circle where the forest was particularly thick. "Hey," he called, "there's another trail over here. Looks like it goes up toward the ridge." No more trails, I said firmly. We've seen enough. David, however, was already walking toward Jake. Just a quick look, he said. We're here, we might as well explore. I watched my husband and son disappear into the tree line, and for a moment the chanting stopped completely. The silence was so sudden and absolute that my ears rang. Emma looked up from her phone, frowning. Where did they go? She asked. I looked toward where they'd entered the forest, but the trail Jake had found was gone. There was nothing but a solid wall of ferns and fallen logs. David, I called. Jake. No answer. Emma and I spent the next 20 minutes calling their names and searching the perimeter of the meadow, but it was like they'd vanished into thin air. The trail they'd taken simply didn't exist anymore. This is impossible, Emma said, her voice tight with panic. I watched them walk right there. Right there, Mom. I pulled out my own phone, hoping to call for help, but there was no signal. Not even one bar. The screen showed only no service, and a battery that was mysteriously draining faster than it should. We need to go back to the RV, I said. Maybe they're already there. But they weren't. The clearing was empty except for our Winnebago, which looked suddenly small and vulnerable against the wall of trees. I tried the CB radio, hoping to reach a ranger station, but got only static. Emma paced back and forth in front of the RV, her anxiety infectious. Where are they, Mom? They wouldn't just leave us. I didn't have an answer. David could be thoughtless, but he wasn't cruel. He would never abandon us in the middle of nowhere, especially not Emma. And Jake, for all his teenage attitude, was responsible. They had to be somewhere nearby. As afternoon faded to evening, my worry curdled into fear. We'd searched every trail we could find, called their names until we were hoarse, and even driven the RV slowly around the Forest Service roads looking for any sign of them. Nothing. Maybe we should try to drive out, Emma suggested as we sat in the RV's dining area, picking at sandwiches neither of us wanted. Find a ranger station or somewhere with phone service. I'd been thinking the same thing, but when I'd tried to start the engine an hour earlier, it had turned over sluggishly before dying completely. The battery gauge showed full charge and all the connections looked tight, but the RV wouldn't start. I think we're stuck here tonight, I admitted, but they'll be back. They have to be. Emma nodded, but I could see the fear in her eyes. The same fear that was eating at my stomach like acid. We locked all the doors and windows, something we'd never done while camping before. As darkness fell, I made a fire in the strange pentagonal ring, more for the light than the warmth. The flames cast dancing shadows across the clearing, and I found myself jumping at every movement in my peripheral vision. Emma dozed fitfully on the couch, her phone clutched in her hand like a talisman. I sat by the window, watching the tree line and listening for any sound that might be David and Jake returning. Instead, I heard the singing again. This time, I was ready for it. I grabbed a flashlight and opened the RV door, stepping into the cold night air. The singing was coming from the forest. The same liquid syllables I'd heard the night before, but louder now, more urgent. "Hello," I called into the darkness. "David, Jake." The singing stopped. In the sudden silence, I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from the direction of the trail we'd taken to the stone circle. I pointed my flashlight toward the sound and saw a figure emerge from the tree line. It was Jake. Relief flooded through me so intensely I nearly collapsed. "Jake," I called, running toward him. "Thank God. Where's your father? Where have you been?" But as I got closer, something made me slow down. Jake was walking strangely. Too straight, too measured, like he was concentrating on each step. His clothes were soaked and muddy, but his face was perfectly clean. And he was smiling. Jake never smiled. "Hi, Mom," he said when I reached him. His voice sounded right, but something in his expression was off. "Sorry we're late. Where's Dad? Is he okay?" "He's coming," Jake said, still smiling that wrong smile. "He wanted me to tell you not to worry." I studied my son's face in the flashlight beam. His eyes were too bright, and he wasn't blinking enough. "Jake, what happened? Where have you been all day?" "We found something," he said. "Something incredible. Dad wants to show you." Before I could ask what he meant, Emma appeared at the RV door. "Mom, is that Jake?" "Yeah, honey," I called back, but I didn't take my eyes off my son. "He's okay." Emma ran over to us but stopped short when she saw Jake's expression. "You look weird," she said bluntly. Jake's smile widened. "Do I? Where's Dad?" Emma asked. "He's waiting for us," Jake said. "At the circle. He sent me to get you." "The stone circle?" I asked. "Why is he still there?" "He found them," Jake said. "The people who live here. They've been waiting for us." A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the October air. "Waiting for us?" Jake nodded enthusiastically. "They knew we were coming. They prepared everything. Dad says we need to join them before midnight or we'll miss our chance." "Our chance? For what?" Emma asked. Jake's smile faltered for just a moment, and in that brief lapse I saw something else in his eyes. Fear, pain, and underneath it all, a desperate plea for help. Then the smile snapped back into place like a mask. "To belong," he said. "To really belong somewhere." I grabbed Emma's hand. "We're going back in the RV, now," but Jake stepped between us and the door. "You can't leave," he said, and his voice had changed. Still Jake's voice, but layered with something else, something older and infinitely patient. "The circle isn't complete without you." Emma tried to push past him, but Jake caught her wrist. His grip was too strong, his fingers too cold. "Let go of me," she said, trying to pull away. "Jake, you're hurting her," I said. He looked down at his sister's wrist as if he'd forgotten he was holding it. When he let go, I could see red marks where his fingers had been, finger-shaped bruises that were already darkening. "Sorry," he said. But he didn't sound sorry. He sounded hungry. I backed toward the RV, pulling Emma with me. "Something's wrong with him," I whispered. Emma nodded, her eyes wide. "That's not Jake," she whispered back. "That's not my brother." The thing wearing Jake's face heard us. Its smile grew impossibly wide, stretching the skin at the corners of its mouth until I was sure it would tear. "Of course I'm Jake," it said. "Who else would I be?" We ran. I shoved Emma into the RV and slammed the door behind us, throwing the deadbolt in the security chain. Through the window, I could see Jake, or what had been Jake, standing in the same spot, still smiling. He didn't move to follow us, didn't try the door. He just stood there, watching. "What's wrong with him?" Emma sobbed. "Mom, what's wrong with my brother?" I didn't have an answer. I tried the engine again, turning the key over and over, but got nothing but clicks from the starter. The battery gauge now showed empty, though it had been full an hour ago. "The radio," I said. "Maybe the CB." But when I tried it, all I got was static. No, not static, something else. Voices, very faint, speaking in the same liquid language I'd heard in the singing. And underneath it, barely audible, David's voice saying my name over and over. "Sarah, Sarah, Sarah." I turned off the radio with shaking hands. Outside, Jake hadn't moved. He stood in the exact same position, rain running down his face, still smiling. His eyes reflected our interior lights like an animal's. "We need to hide," I told Emma. "Turn off all the lights." We plunged the RV into darkness and crouched below the window line. Through a gap in the curtains, I could see Jake's silhouette against the gray night sky. He stood there for another hour before finally walking back into the forest, moving with that same measured, too careful gait. Emma fell asleep around dawn, exhausted by fear and adrenaline. I dozed fitfully in the driver's seat, jerking awake every few minutes to check the windows. The clearing remained empty, but I could feel eyes on us from the darkness between the trees. When full daylight came, I forced myself to think clearly. David and Jake had been missing for almost 24 hours. Whatever had come back wearing Jake's face, it wasn't my son. Which meant my husband and real son were still out there somewhere, possibly hurt, possibly worse. I needed help, but first I needed to get Emma to safety. "We're walking out," I told her over instant coffee and granola bars. Following the road back to the main highway, Emma looked pale and haggard. "What about Dad and Jake?" "I'll come back for them," I lied. "With the Rangers, with help." We packed light, water, energy bars, rain gear, the few matches I could find. I left a note for David, just in case, though I was increasingly certain he would never read it. The Forest Service road was in worse shape than I remembered, rutted and muddy from the constant rain. We'd walked maybe a mile when Emma grabbed my arm. "Mom," she whispered, "look." Ahead of us, the road forked. To the right was the way we'd come in, I was sure of it. But to the left was another road that hadn't been there yesterday, marked with the same bone-and-tooth trail markers we'd seen in the forest. "That wasn't there before," Emma said. I stared at the new road. It looked older than the main service road, the asphalt cracked and overgrown with moss, but it was clearly marked with a wooden sign. Sunset Campground, 2 miles. "We came from the right," I said, more to convince myself than Emma. "That's the way out." But when we took the right fork, it led us in a wide circle that brought us back to the same intersection. And now there were 3 roads instead of 2. Emma was hyperventilating. "This isn't possible," she gasped. "Roads don't just appear." I was beginning to understand that possibility had nothing to do with what was happening to us. "Come on," I said, taking her hand. "We'll follow the creek. Water always leads downhill." But there was no creek. The sound of running water that had guided us on yesterday's hike was gone, replaced by the same oppressive silence that seemed to blanket the entire forest. We walked for hours, trying to navigate by compass, but the needle spun wildly, never settling on any direction for more than a few seconds. The trees all looked the same. Massive trunks, moss-draped branches, shadows that moved when we weren't looking directly at them. By afternoon, I realized we were lost. Completely, hopelessly lost. Every trail led back to the stone circle, and every attempt to bushwhack through the forest brought us to the same pentagonal clearing where our RV waited like a trap. "They're hurting us," I said as we stood once again at the edge of our campsite. "Whoever they are, they want us here." Emma was crying now, exhausted and terrified. "I want to go home," she sobbed. "I want Dad and Jake back." I held her while she cried, but my eyes were on the forest. Somewhere in that green maze, my husband and son were either trapped or dead. And something wearing Jake's face was waiting for us to make a mistake. As the second night fell, I barricaded us inside the RV. I pushed the dinette table against the door and hung blankets over all the windows. Emma sat on the couch with a knife from the kitchen, while I clutched a heavy flashlight like a club. Around midnight, Jake came back. "Mom," his voice called from outside. "Emma, I found Dad. He's hurt, but he's okay. You need to come help me carry him." Emma started to get up, but I grabbed her arm. "That's not your brother," I whispered. "Mom, please," Jake's voice continued. "He's bleeding. I can't get him back to the RV by myself." Emma was crying again. What if it really is him? What if Dad's hurt and we're just sitting here? I wanted to believe it. God, how I wanted to believe it. But I remembered the too wide smile, the cold fingers, the way he'd stood in the rain without shivering. "Mom?" Jake called again. "Are you going to let Dad die out here?" I pressed my hands over my ears, but I could still hear him. His voice was changing, becoming more plaintive, more desperate. "Please, Mom. I'm scared. Something's wrong with me. I need you to come help me." Emma was sobbing now. "Mom, what if he's really hurt? What if whatever happened to him is wearing off?" The voice outside had devolved into wordless crying, the sound of a teenage boy broken and afraid. It was the most heartbreaking thing I'd ever heard, and every maternal instinct I had screamed at me to unlock the door and go to my child. Instead, I turned on the CB radio. Through the static, I could hear David's voice again, but closer now. "Sarah," it said. "Sarah, I'm coming. Stay where you are. I'm coming home." But David's voice was coming from outside the RV. Right outside our bedroom window. I crept to the back of the RV and peered through a gap in the curtains. David stood in the clearing, maybe 10 feet from our door. He was naked, his skin pale and streaked with mud. His hair hung in wet tangles around his face and his eyes. His eyes were completely black. "Sarah," he called, his voice perfectly normal despite his appearance. "The door's locked. I can't get in." Behind him, Jake had stopped crying. He stood at the edge of the clearing, no longer bothering to maintain his human facade. His smile had stretched so wide it split his cheeks, and something dark leaked from the corners of his mouth. "They're not them," Emma whispered. "They're not Dad and Jake." David tried the door handle, then knocked politely. "Sarah, what's wrong? Why won't you let me in?" I closed my eyes and tried to think. Whatever these things were, they needed us to come to them willingly. They could mimic my family, but they couldn't force their way inside. Not yet. "Sarah," David called again. "I know you're frightened, but you need to trust me. We found something amazing out there. Something that can fix everything that's wrong with us." Despite everything, I felt a flutter of hope. What if this was real David? What if whatever had happened in the forest had just changed him somehow, but it was still really him? I started toward the door before I caught myself. That's what they wanted. Doubt, hope, the desperate desire to believe that everything could still be okay. The knocking stopped. In the silence that followed, I heard new voices, women's voices, singing that same haunting melody I'd heard the first night. But now it was coming from all around us, from every direction at once. Through the curtains, I could see lights moving through the forest. Dozens of them, like candles or torches, weaving between the trees in complex patterns. The singing grew louder, and with it came the sound of footsteps. Not just David and Jake now, but many people walking in rhythm around our RV. "Mom," Emma whispered, "look at the fire ring." The pentagonal stones were glowing again, but brighter than before. The light pulsed in time with the singing, and I could see figures materializing around it. Women in long robes, their faces turned upward, their mouths open in song. But these weren't the same women I'd seen the first night. These were wrong. Their limbs too long, their fingers ending in points, their eyes reflecting the stone light like mirrors. They moved around the fire ring in perfect synchronization, but their feet didn't touch the ground. "We need to run," I said. "Now." But when I tried the door, it wouldn't open. The deadbolt turned freely. The security chain slid aside, but the door itself was stuck fast. I threw my weight against it, but it was like pushing against a wall. The windows wouldn't open either. Even the roof vents were sealed shut. We were trapped. The singing reached a crescendo, and the light from the stones became blinding. I could hear David outside, still calling my name, but his voice was layered now with harmonics that human vocal cords couldn't produce. Emma was hyperventilating again. "I can't breathe," she gasped. "Mom, I can't breathe." The air inside the RV was getting thick, like soup. Each breath was a struggle, and I could taste something metallic on my tongue. The walls seemed to be pressing inward, the ceiling lowering with each pulse of light from outside. Through the curtains, I could see the ritual reaching its climax. The robed figures had multiplied until there were dozens of them, all circling the fire ring in perfect unison. In the center of the ring, something was taking shape, a dark mass that writhed and twisted like smoke made solid. And standing at the edge of the clearing, David and Jake watched with their black eyes and impossible smiles. Emma collapsed onto the floor, her lips turning blue. The air was so thick now I could barely move. My vision was starting to gray at the edges, and I realized we were suffocating. Whatever was happening outside was using up all the oxygen, leaving us to die like bugs in a jar. I had one last idea. Desperate, and probably suicidal, but better than dying, trapped like animals. I grabbed the fire extinguisher from under the kitchen sink and smashed out the front window. Cold air rushed in, along with the smell of smoke and something else. Something rotten and sweet that made my stomach lurch. The singing faltered for a moment, and I could hear angry voices in that unknown language. "Come on," I gasped, hauling Emma to her feet. "We're going out the window." Emma was barely conscious, but I managed to push her through the broken window and into the clearing. I followed, cutting my hands on the glass, not caring about the pain. The ritual was collapsing around us. The robed figures were screaming now instead of singing, their voices like breaking glass. The dark thing in the center of the fire ring was writhing more violently, and I could see it had faces. Dozens of human faces pressed against its surface like people drowning in black water. David and Jake ran toward us, their movements inhuman and predatory. But they were too late. I grabbed Emma and bolted for the forest, crashing through the underbrush like a wounded animal. Behind us, the screaming reached a pitch that made my ears bleed. The forest lit up like a strobe light, and I could hear trees falling with thunderous crashes. Whatever we'd interrupted, it was angry. We ran blindly through the darkness, branches tearing at our clothes and faces. Emma was stronger now, fueled by terror and adrenaline. We stumbled over logs, slipped in muddy creek beds, and pushed through walls of ferns that left us soaked and scratched. After what felt like hours, we emerged onto a paved road, an actual highway, with yellow lines and reflective markers. In the distance, I could see the glow of electric lights. We walked toward the lights, supporting each other, not daring to look back. A trucker picked us up just after dawn, a kind man who asked no questions about our torn clothes and wild eyes. He drove us to the nearest town, where I called the police. The search and rescue team found our RV 3 days later, but it was empty. The clearing where we'd camped was scorched black, the ancient trees reduced to charcoal husks. The stone fire ring was gone, just a crater in the earth filled with ash and what the investigators described as unidentifiable organic material. They never found David or Jake. The official report classified them as missing persons, presumed dead due to exposure. But I knew better. I knew they were still out there, somewhere in that forest, waiting for the next family to stumble into the wrong campground. Emma and I moved to Portland after the funerals. We don't talk about what happened, but sometimes I catch her staring at nothing, her eyes wide and frightened. She's started college now, studying anthropology, but she won't go camping, won't even walk in the woods behind our apartment. I don't blame her. Sometimes, late at night, I think I can hear them singing. That same haunting melody that pulled us deeper and deeper into something we were never meant to survive. And sometimes, when I'm driving alone and pass a Forest Service road, I see figures in my rearview mirror. They're always smiling. Last month, Emma showed me something she'd found while researching local folklore for a class project. A newspaper article from 1987 about a family of 4 who disappeared while camping in Gifford Pinchot Forest. The Hendersons, Mark, Linda, and their 2 teenage daughters. 3 days after they were reported missing, Linda Henderson walked out of the forest alone. She told authorities that her family had been taken by the Gathering Circle, and that she'd only escaped by interrupting their ritual. The police found their campsite burned to ash, just like ours. Linda Henderson spent the rest of her life in and out of psychiatric facilities. She died last year, but according to the article, she never stopped insisting that her family was still alive in the forest, waiting for the circle to be completed, waiting for the right people to find the right campground on the right night. People like us. I think about Linda Henderson a lot these days. I think about whether she really escaped, or whether something wearing her face walked out of those woods and lived among us for 35 years. I think about the handprint I found on the inside of our window that first night, and how it perfectly matched Emma's hand. Most of all, I think about the dreams Emma's been having lately. She tells me she sees Jake in them, standing at the edge of a stone circle, calling her name. She says he looks exactly the same as the day we lost him, except for his smile and his eyes. She says his eyes are completely black now, just like David's were that last night. She says he tells her not to worry, that the circle is almost complete, that all they need is one more, just one more. I've been watching Emma carefully since she told me about the dreams, checking her eyes in the mirror when she's not looking, listening to her voice for changes. So far, she seems normal. But then again, so did Jake, right up until the moment he wasn't. The really terrifying part is that I want to believe her dreams are real. I want to believe that David and Jake are still alive somewhere, waiting for us to find them. I catch myself looking up Forest Service campgrounds online, reading about remote sites in Washington state, places where a family could camp alone, far from civilization, places where a circle could be completed. Emma graduated early from high school and started college at 17. She's brilliant, always has been, but lately her intelligence has taken on a different quality. She knows things she shouldn't know. Obscure historical facts, dead languages, the names of plants that don't grow in Oregon. Yesterday, I found her drawing symbols in her notebook, the same symbols we'd seen carved into the stones in Gifford Pinchot Forest. When I asked her about them, she looked up at me with eyes that were just a shade darker than they'd been the day before, and smiled. "Just something I remembered," she said, "from a dream. I keep telling myself I'm being paranoid, that trauma does strange things to people, that Emma's just processing what happened to us in the only way she knows how. But last night, I woke up to find her standing by my bedroom window, staring out at the small patch of woods behind our apartment complex. "Emma," I whispered, "what are you doing?" She turned to me, and for just a moment her smile was too wide and her eyes reflected the streetlight like glass. "Listening," she said. "They're calling." Then she blinked and she was just my daughter again, confused and a little embarrassed to be found sleepwalking. "Sorry, Mom," she said. "Weird dream." But I saw the symbols she'd traced in the condensation on the window. The same symbols from the stones, the same symbols from her notebook. "I think the circle is almost complete. I think they're going to finish what they started, one way or another. And I think Emma's going to help them." Tonight, she asked me if I ever missed camping, if I ever thought about going back to Washington State. She said she'd been researching the area for her anthropology thesis, and she'd found some interesting historical sites. Places where families used to gather. Places where circles were drawn in stone. She showed me her research. Maps and photos and legends dating back centuries. Stories of a gathering that happens every autumn, when the veil between worlds grows thin. A ritual that requires specific participants, bloodlines that can open the way for something ancient and hungry. "We're part of it now," she explained, her voice patient and gentle. "Whether we want to be or not, the circle has to be completed." As she spoke, I noticed her teeth looked different. Sharper. "What happens if the circle isn't completed?" I asked. Emma smiled, and this time there was no mistaking it for my daughter's expression. "Then they come here instead," she said. "All of them. And they won't need a ritual to take what they want. I'm writing this now while Emma sleeps, though I'm not sure she's really sleeping anymore. I can hear her whispering to herself in that liquid language, and sometimes she laughs in a voice that isn't quite her own. I have a choice to make. I can keep running, keep hiding, keep pretending that what happened in Gifford Pinchot Forest was just trauma and hallucination. I can watch my remaining daughter slowly transform into something else while telling myself it's all in my head, or I can accept that some invitations can't be refused. Emma left a map on the kitchen table today, hand-drawn, detailed, showing every back road and forest service trail between here and a small clearing in the Cascade Mountains. At the center of the clearing, she'd drawn a pentagon with symbols around the border. Under the map was a note in her handwriting. October 31st, midnight. The circle will be complete. Halloween. Of course, I could burn the map. I could take Emma to a hospital, tell them she's having a breakdown. I could run as far and as fast as I can and hope that distance means safety. But I've seen what they can do. I've seen how they bend reality to their will, how they make roads appear and compasses lie, how they take the people you love and send back perfect copies that hunger for your soul. There's nowhere to run that they can't follow. Emma's stirring now. In a few minutes, she'll wake up and ask me if I've made my decision. She'll smile with teeth that are getting sharper by the day, and she'll explain again why fighting them is pointless. She'll remind me that David and Jake are waiting for us in the circle, and that they're probably suffering while they wait. She'll tell me that belonging is better than being lost. And maybe she's right. Maybe becoming part of something larger than yourself is better than fighting alone against the dark. Maybe the peace I've seen in her eyes lately is real, even if it comes with a terrible price. The clock on the RV's dashboard shows 11:30 p.m. In 30 minutes, it will be Halloween. In 30 minutes, one way or another, the circle will be complete. Emma's eyes are open now, reflecting the dim light from my laptop screen. She's smiling that not quite right smile, and her teeth catch the light like knives. "Ready, Mom?" she asks. I close my laptop and stand up. Outside, I can hear the singing starting again. That beautiful, terrible melody that's been haunting my dreams for 3 weeks. The melody that sounds like home. Yes, I hear myself say. I'm ready. And as we walk out into the October night, toward the Forest Service road that will take us back to the clearing where it all began, I realize that I am ready. Ready to see David and Jake again, even if they're not quite themselves anymore. Ready to stop running from something that was always going to catch us eventually. Ready to complete the circle. The trees are closer than they were before, pressing in against the sides of the road like eager spectators. Their branches form an archway overhead, blocking out the stars, and ahead of us, barely visible through the rain, lights dance between the trunks. Candle lights, torch lights, the lights of the gathering. Emma takes my hand as we walk, her fingers cold but strong. She's humming along with the singing now, and I find myself joining in without knowing the words. The melody is in my blood, in my bones, in the rhythm of my heart. It's always been there, I realize. I just needed to come back to remember it. The clearing opens before us like a mouth, and I can see them all now. Dozens of robed figures moving in their eternal dance around the pentagon of stones. In the center, David and Jake wait for us, their arms outstretched, their faces bright with joy. They look exactly as they did in life, except for their eyes. Except for their beautiful, terrible black eyes. "Welcome home," Emma says, and her voice is layers deep now, echoing with the voices of all the others who came before us. All the families who found their way to this place and discovered what they'd really been searching for. I step into the circle, and the stones pulse with light that feels like recognition, like coming home after a long, exhausting journey. The last thing I remember as myself is the feeling of belonging. Real belonging. Deeper than marriage or family or any human connection I'd ever known. The feeling of being part of something vast and ancient and eternally hungry. The feeling of being complete. But sometimes, when the circle dims and the ritual pauses between songs, I remember enough to warn others. Sometimes I can push through the beautiful piece long enough to remember what I lost. What we all lost. If you find this story, if you read these words, please listen to what I'm trying to tell you. Don't go to Gifford Pinchot Forest. Don't follow the unmarked roads or the bone trail markers. Don't stop at Sunset Campground, no matter how lost you are. Because we're still there, all of us. All the families who thought they were just going camping, just trying to reconnect, just looking for a little peace in the wilderness. We're still there, and we're waiting. The circle is never really complete, you see. There's always room for one more family, one more set of voices to join the song, one more chance to belong to something beautiful and terrible and eternal. So please, if you're reading this, stay away from the deep woods. Stay away from the places that aren't on any map. Stay away from the clearings where the stones remember older gods. Stay away, or join us. Either way, the circle will be complete, and the gathering will sing forever.